Welcome to the Made for This podcast, where we want to help you discover, develop, and live your Made for This. Now, Nikki, since this is the very first episode, I figure we should, number one, introduce ourselves as the hosts, but also just introduce this whole idea of Made for This. Like, what the heck is it? What do we do with that information? So this is the first episode. Let's talk about it.
Yeah, and why are we using it as a noun?
Yeah, that is a good question, and that's something that we've actually been challenged on before. Yep. I think, but I think that's like it's on purpose. It's a noun on purpose.
You love it or you don't. There's no in between.
And we love it, and that's just it. And if we hope that if you're listening to this, you love it too, and that's just the relationship we're gonna have.
Yeah.
So I'm Josh. I'm one of the two main hosts here on the Made for This podcast alongside Nikki, and I am. Just a little bit about me, just to introduce myself a little bit. I'm a husband and a dad. My wife and I have 3 crazy little kiddos, all adopted. And I am a small business owner. I have a freelance videography business. And I'm really passionate about this conversation with the whole Made for This thing, just because I feel like, I was born with a specific purpose. And I believe that that's something, number one, worth pursuing and developing, but number 2, it's something worth perpetuating. Like, I feel like all of us were made for something, and I want to kind of start that conversation and help people walk through that journey.
Yeah. And so I'm Nikki, and I, like Josh, also am married. So I have a husband, and we have 2 kids who are much older than Josh. So we have a high schooler and soon to be middle schooler, both ours. And I have recently gone back to being a homemaker, which I was for 8 years. And we'll get a little bit more into our individual kind of journeys in later episodes. And I also do work with nonprofits in our areas. And so that's something I'm really passionate about. And with developing You're Made for This, I have found that the times that I have been most fulfilled and happiest and really knew who I was and what my purpose has been when I've been living in my Made for This. And so that's why I'm so passionate about helping other people achieve that, because I think it's very valuable to be able to answer the big questions of who am I, where do I belong, and why am I here?
Yeah, that's great. And you're really good at that. Nikki and I have, a long history of having some of these conversations with one another and with others, and we've worked together in the past. And we're going to talk more about this in later episodes. But one of your greatest strengths, if you're familiar with the Strengths Finder, it's an assessment that Nikki and I have both taken and enjoyed. One of your greatest strengths is that whole individualization thing. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah. So my number one strength on the Strength Finder is individualization, which is essentially the ability to look at each individual person as an individual and not as a stereotype or a part of a whole bigger picture, but to look at them, what makes them tick, who they are, and then how that fits into their place in the world, and how they can uniquely fit in to places and kind of fill spots that only they can.
Yeah, and so this first episode here, we're going to talk a lot more about that idea. Like, what is this whole idea of Made for This? But that is a great example of it. Like, each of us are super unique, like one of one, and you have a distinct ability to kind of recognize that and start to pull that out of people as kind of a natural gifting of yours.
Yeah. So speaking of uniqueness, we knew that we wanted a little bit of levity on our podcast because trying to find your purpose in life is heavy. Yep. And so we wanted to introduce a little segment that we call Silly Debates. And the first one that we'll have on the podcast is courtesy of my teenage son, who referred to Subway the other day as a hibachi restaurant. And I don't know how I feel about that. And so I wanted to get your opinion on Subway in the genre of hibachi restaurants.
Okay. Right out of the gate, I'm going to say that's not going to fly. I don't think that Subway is a hibachi restaurant. Well, first, what do you think?
I don't think so.
Okay, so
I don't think cold cuts can equate to raw food to cooked food with a show.
Yeah, I agree with that. So what was the rationale behind that in this initial conversation?
We were discussing tipping culture. He had an assignment for civics, I think, about how prominent tipping has become in our culture and that everyone asks you for a tip. And so we got on the topic of Subway, and he said, well, Subway deserves a tip because they're basically hibachi. And I was like, don't know how I feel about that, because then that opens up a whole realm of, Chipotle and Moe's and Cold Stone and all of the places that prepare food in front of you, are we then putting them all into the category of hibachi? And it's like
Speaking,
cultural appropriation also,
mm,
which is a whole nother can of worms.
that is. Speaking of, though, we'll leave a link in the description of this video if you just want to leave us a tip. Like, we'll just take
You just tip us.
we'll
It's
just
fine.
take tips. You can just tip us. No, I would say that, and this maybe isn't much of a debate since you and I are on the same page. Although, if you're listening to this or watching this on YouTube or wherever you're, interacting with us, leave us a comment. Let us know your opinion on this, because maybe there is some more debate that we're not privy to just yet. But I would say that all of those other places that you listed, Subway and Moe's and Chipotle, like those seem a little bit more on the same page to me. Like, even though, it's cold cut subs
Right.
versus a burrito, but I feel like that, like, I can track with that. It's when like a performer in a chef's hat and with knives comes out and puts on this big show with you with fire,
Yeah.
and then you eat a pretty good meal afterwards. Like
Right.
hibachi, like I know a lot of people feel a lot of different ways about whatever hibachi, but I feel like hibachi is a pretty solid meal.
It
Like
is.
it's good. Subway, eh.
Yeah. See, so then when you bring in that description, then if you look at Cold Stone, because they have the spoons that they click together,
Yeah,
and if you put a tip in the jar, they'll do the cheer things.
yeah.
And so they do entertain you.
Mm.
And
Do
there
they
is an element of like mixing ingredients in, and it goes from one thing to something new and exciting.
do they all yell at you when you walk through the door, or is that
They do.
sometimes?
They yell like the welcome to Cold Stone.
Yeah. Hmm. They don't yell at me at the hibachi restaurant though.
That's true. I feel like we just really need to know, what do you categorize those restaurants? If they're not hibachi,
Yeah, I
which
would
we
say.
agree they're not, there has to be a title for that type of food service where
Hmm.
it's not what you want when you walk in, but you get to see them make what you want from
Yeah.
start to finish, because that is a unique category that I think is becoming more popular.
Yeah, there's pizza places that do that now. I'm here for it. I
Oh, we
like
had
it.
a pizza place
Yeah.
that was so good.
Yeah.
COVID killed it.
COVID.
Rip.
Hmm. Yeah. Okay. So if you're hearing this, let us know. However, there's an email. There's gonna be an email in the
Yeah.
description or in the show notes, and then if you're watching on YouTube or whatever, just drop us a comment. Let's have some conversation, because number one, if you want to try to convince us that that is a hibachi style restaurant, good luck.
Yeah.
But number two, if you have some sort of name for those other kind of made for you, in front of you type of places, we'd be interested to hear it.
Yes.
So, kind of transitioning into sort of what we plan to talk about today. What the heck is made for this,
And why is it a noun?
and why is it a noun? So
Because it is a
it's
noun.
definitely a noun. So give us your best description, Nikki.
And so in my mind, made for this, it's a noun because it is a thing,
Mhm.
and it is your unique purpose. It answers the three questions that we're all asking: who am I? Where do I belong? And what is my purpose?
Mm-hmm.
That is what your made for this does. And those are the questions. The research has shown that those are the core three questions at the heart of every single question we ask as humans. And your made for this answers all of those.
Yeah, I think that's a great description. So who am I? Where do I
belong?
And what's my purpose?
Yeah.
Yeah, those are existential questions
Yeah.
that we're
And
all
that is to give props. That's the Fuller Institute. They did the research.
the
and
Fuller
came-
Institute.
The Fuller Institute came out with those are the three questions that
Well,
everybody's asking.
They don't call it the made for this though, so
Right.
we got that. But yeah, those are and that's true. Those are really good questions, and we're all wrestling with those, even if it's unconscious sometimes.
Right. Well, they maintain that it's at the heart of everything. It's at the heart of, what am I going to do Friday night?
Mm, yeah.
Like, it comes down to even those small things of, what am I going to do? What are my plans for the weekend? You're asking, where do I belong?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what am I going to,
Who am I going to go with?
Right. Who am I going to go with? What is my career going to be? That's asking, who am I? What's my purpose?
Mm-hmm.
It's pretty much every question you can dial back into those three questions.
Yeah, that's interesting. Everything sort of is derivative of
Mhm.
if you're not answering one of those questions, then you're really not
Yeah.
you're really not wrestling with the reality of your life. I would 100% affirm and agree with your definition of made for this. And I think I would just maybe build on top of that, saying that I've always sort of viewed it as, you just said the Fuller Institute's second question is, where do I belong?
Mhm.
And I feel like belonging, and I know that Brene Brown, you and I have talked a lot in the past about Brene Brown and her sort of mechanisms around belonging. And
Mhm.
we can talk some more about that. But for me, the made for this has always been like, if I have discovered and I'm developing or living in my made for this, my uniqueness, my purpose is like that is the pinnacle of belonging.
Yeah.
Because if I'm trying to, like, I'm doing like you're great with teenagers. Like that's one of your greatest strengths. You're great with teenagers. I'm a little scared of teenagers. And so if I'm thrust into a situation where I have to interact with a bunch of teenagers, especially professionally or as like a leader type role, then I am way out of my element,
Yeah.
and I don't feel I'm not operating in my my unique strengths and gifts, and I feel like I don't really belong in that
Yeah.
situation.
Absolutely. Something I talk to teenagers about when they're discovering their purpose and passion and those types of things is to notice what you're not good at,
Mm,
because you're made for this. Knowing you're made for this frees you up to know when your yes should be your yes and your no should be a no.
that's good.
You don't sit in seats that don't belong to you.
Yeah,
When you know what you're made for this is, you're not going to step in to a situation and claim to be an expert or be good at something that you know you're
when
not.
it's
You're not trying on identities and trying on all of these different things, because you know these are the things that I'm meant for. These are the things I'm good at. This is my made for this. And so anything that doesn't fall, it's almost like having a personal mission statement.
yeah,
And so you know what is kind of, drifting away from that, and
yeah.
you can say no to it.
Yeah, that's really good. So I'm a nerdy type of person, and I have a personal vision statement. And we're gonna do an episode where we'll talk more about Nikki and I's individual kind of made for this mission type stuff here in just a few episodes. But I mean I have that, and I have always sort of equated those two things. Like the reason I was put on this earth, like
Mhm.
I was made for this, and that this is very different for each individual person, but it's also like yours is never going to be mine. Mine's never going to
Right.
be yours. It's always going to be unique to me, one of one. And that's what makes it so fascinating. But like living like my videography business, that's part of the language that I like to use at my business, is that I want to help people multiply their mission,
Yeah.
and whatever it is. And made for this can be interchanged with mission in that
Right.
context. I want to help people know what it is and really get that out into the world in whatever way is most appropriate for whatever their mission or made for this is.
Yeah. I didn't prepare you for this question, so I
Uh-oh.
apologize. Do you think that you're made for this can change
Hmm.
over time?
I think I think it evolves. I don't know that it I don't know that it goes from, well, okay, going back to my example, like I guess I'm going to be a parent of teenagers eventually.
Right.
Um,
Well,
it,
I'm thinking like you stepped into foster
mm-hmm.
care, which may not necessarily be 100% in line with your strengths and giftings,
Oh yeah, that's true.
but it's something that I would argue you were created for. That's a part of your story and a part of your journey.
Yeah, yeah. I think it evolves as time progresses, and as we develop and grow into ourselves and into our understanding of our made for this, our purpose. I feel like it does grow and adapt with us.
Yeah.
I don't think it. I don't know that it just wholesale changes.
Right.
Like I don't know that I'm ever just going to be like the guy that wants to be in a room of 30 teenagers and just be like super comfy there. Like, but that's you.
Yeah.
But I'm gonna have three of my own. They're gonna have friends. I know that I will be in situations where like I need to be better at that, and I think that I will grow and adapt into that.
Yeah.
But as we get a little deeper into this here in just a couple episodes, we're actually going to start kind of having the conversation of how does one start to discover what theirs is, and the kind of the keystone part of that entire exercise is looking at your experiences in
Hmm.
life. And I feel like every single experience compounds on those that you've had in the past.
Right.
And so I wouldn't say I don't know that my made for this, or I don't know that one's made for this necessarily just totally changes.
Yeah.
But I'd say that as those experiences compound, it can look a lot different from one season of life to another.
Yeah. And I think too, the reason I asked that question is because I think about people I've known that there have been just events in their life or experiences in their life that completely altered
Hmm.
who they are
Yeah.
and where they belong because of life altering moments.
Yeah.
And up until that point, they would never have said that they're made for this, is what it is on the other side of that event.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense.
And so I think there has to be some room. I don't want people listening to the podcast to think once you figure it out, you're good
That's
and
true.
you've nailed it, because I think there's some room for things to happen
Yeah.
and, life altering experiences to come and open windows and doors to things that you probably never would have imagined yourself being involved in or caring about. Those things that, and we'll talk about later on, the things that wake you up in the morning and the
Mhm.
things that keep you up at night can shift and change based on the things that you encounter.
I can definitely say over the last several years, like as I've experienced things and I've evolved, my made for this has adapted to
Yeah.
my surroundings. I can definitely say that the things that wake me up in the morning and the things that keep me up at night have shifted.
Yeah.
I as before I was a parent, like that was none of it, because it really, like, I mean, not that I didn't love
Right.
people's kids, but now that I'm a parent, it's like that's something that, like, it will wake me up or keep
Yeah.
me up. And so yeah, I think that that's definitely something to keep in mind, and especially to point out. So yeah. So tell us, Nikki, a little more about I've done some reading and engaging with this as well, but you have a lot more to say about it. Brene Brown has a lot of content around. She doesn't use the made for this language,
Right.
but she has a lot of content around the belonging angle, and when I think when we're talking about, just answering the question, what is a made for this,
Hmm.
the noun, what is a made for this? I feel like her angle um, really shed a lot of light on it for me.
Yeah.
So just share a little bit about that.
Yeah. And you can look up YouTube clips on Brene Brown talking about this because she is just
Ac-
phenomenal.
And actually, if you have a favorite segment,
Oh,
we
yeah.
can link
I'll
that in
look
the
and see
show
if I can
notes.
find what we can link. So Brene Brown basically contrasts the difference between fitting in, which honestly is probably what our culture tries to get us to do more
Mm-hmm.
than anything with trends and all of these different things. Contrast that with belonging because they're not the same thing.
Mm.
And oftentimes in our culture, they're used interchangeably. And so she basically explains that fitting in at its core means that we have to assess the situation, assess the dynamic, assess the people, and then change something about ourselves to be able to sit
Mm-hmm.
at that table or be in that group, to be able to be accepted.
Right.
And her whole thing is that once you do that, you've betrayed yourself and you belong nowhere because
Mm.
you don't even belong to yourself, because you're not being true to who you are and who you're made to be, or you're made for this. And so her whole thing is to seek out belonging, seek out the places, the people that when you show up exactly who you are, you have a seat and
Mm.
that you can immediately be in that place and be appreciated for your strengths and your weaknesses and all of who you are and what you're made to be. And so that is really essentially when we ask, where do we belong? Sometimes we get caught up in the fitting in
Yeah.
and we miss out on the true belonging, that's what we're actually seeking and what we're asking for. And the Fuller Institute actually says that that's the number one question, that while we
The
ask the other
question.
two, belonging is really at the
Mm.
heart of everything, and that's what we're always kind of driving for,
I feel
is
like
finding belonging.
I feel like the other two questions kind of bookend that
Hmm.
question. Like, if you know where you belong, you can sort of figure out what's my purpose, and
Yeah.
if you know where you belong, then that sort of speaks to your identity or
Hmm.
your the who
Yeah.
am I thing. Okay, so I can already hear the detractors, in the comments or at other, avenues. What if, like, I saw a meme on Facebook or something the other day that said, we need to normalize the idea of, I'm going to work on that, as opposed to that's just who I am. I was just
Right.
made that way
Yeah.
or whatever. So where in the fit in versus belonging conversation, where is personal or I guess self awareness and self
Right.
discovery and growth? Where does that fit into all that?
Yeah, that's a tricky thing, because there are things like I'm not good at math, and so I just don't do it anymore.
Oh, that's
I
good.
don't have to.
Don't you remember from high school that
Mhm.
they told
They
us
lied.
we would not have a calculator in our
Yeah.
pocket?
You have to learn to do this in your head.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that is
no,
not true.
they were liars. So I quit doing math. And that really doesn't hurt anybody
Yeah, right.
because it's not a part of my day to day. There's all kinds of apps for me to help my kids with homework. But there are things about me that aren't necessarily who I am or who I was created to be, but because of experiences or things have shaped who I am today, that I can recognize with that, being self aware that are not good for me or for the people around me.
Hmm.
And those are the things that you have to feel, recognize, and then heal from.
Yeah.
And so I think those are the things that if it's going to affect other people in a negative way, we're going to have to look at those things. But if it just comes down to you're not mechanically inclined, then maybe just avoid things,
Yeah.
put people around you that can fill in those weaknesses. If you're not organized, find tools
Right.
to help you be more organized. There's just some things you can't be great at everything.
Yeah.
You
Well,
just can't.
well, and there's a lot of schools of thought. I know Craig Rochelle has done some content on this. There's a lot of schools of thought that say that you shouldn't try to be
Right.
decent at 10 things. You should just be really good at one thing and then bring in
Yeah.
people. I know that John Maxwell has always said too, you want to hire your weaknesses
Hmm.
because you can hire someone who's really good at that. And you don't have to be really good at it.
Yeah.
Something that the StrengthsFinder folks have uncovered through their research is that your greatest strengths, well, it's called the StrengthsFinder, but what it really is it identifies kind of your top talents, and all of those talents have to still be developed
Right.
before they can operate as strengths. And so they talk about, that's Gallup that does
Hmm.
the StrengthsFinder stuff, and they talk about, your key talents are those things that you're going to be naturally inclined to be very good at. And the other things, you really don't want to waste your time getting very good at those things, because you're going to spend 80% of
Yeah.
your time getting like mediocre at something,
Hmm.
when you could spend that 80% getting rock solid world class at something.
Yeah.
And I think that it's important that we recognize if we're weak in certain areas, especially if those areas impact
Right.
others around us. We need to achieve some sort of core competency. Like, we need to get good enough at it that we're not dragging the
Right.
ship down, right? But we don't need to focus so much on those things that it takes away from everything else. And we can use that time and energy to focus on, like, I'm really good at. I'm
Yeah.
One of my strengths is analytical, and I kind of lean that way naturally, and so I can, hone that strength of analyzing a situation or whatever I'm working with, and providing something fruitful out of that, as opposed to like another one of the strengths that I don't know all my strengths, like the bottom ones you have to
Right.
pay extra for, and I haven't done that, but I'm 100% sure that woo is not in my top 20. And
And I'm
I'm
embarrassed to say that's in my top 5.
yeah,
So
I'm just not gonna practice that. I want to get good enough at it where I don't come across as as like I'm
yeah.
like a proverbial or a metaphorical punch in the face every time I talk to somebody. But I don't think I need that to become like, that guy's the best I've ever seen at the woo thing.
Yeah.
Like, that's just never gonna happen. It would take all my time and energy, and then I would suck at everything else.
Yeah. So speaking of that, and again, didn't prepare you for this. I apologize. One of the questions that we've talked about having consistently when we bring other people
Yeah.
on is that asking people what are the immutable parts about themselves?
Oh
What
yeah.
are the things that are so you that you could never turn off? As we're talking about strengths and things that are just like, what are those things about you that that's Josh, and you can't turn them off even if you wanted to?
I know mine. Do you want to answer, or you want me to answer?
I know mine, but I asked you, so
Okay. Well, I want to hear yours too.
yeah.
Mine is 100% that I'm going to ask 100 questions. I'm going to ask 100 questions. Even if you've presented me with a great idea and I'm like, that's a great idea. And then I'm still going to punch holes in it and ask 100
Josh will
questions.
always say, "I wonder."
I wonder. I wonder if this, I wonder if that.
Yep.
Speaking of that, we'll get into the Working Genius stuff later, but Patrick Lencioni's stuff on the Working Genius
Yeah.
is really cool, and really fascinating. And I'm a wonder. Like that's just part of who I am. It's part of my made for this. I was wired that way, and I will 10 out of 10 times ask 100 questions. I just can't turn that off. If I turn that off, and here's where we get back to the Brene Brown thing.
Hmm.
If I turn that off, then I'm, you know, polishing and shaving things
Yeah,
off to
you're
fit
denying
into the
yourself.
groove of whatever that table that I'm trying to sit around needs me to be.
Yeah.
And I ask 100 questions, and while they come across contentious to some people, 99% of the time, I would say that I'm really trying to support whatever it is that we're talking about. If
Yeah.
you pitch me an idea and I think it's awesome, I'm going to ask you 100 hard questions and you're going to be like, dang, Josh really busted up my idea. But then by the end, like because I'm an analytical
Right.
person and because, or by the end, I feel like we're going to have something a little tighter and stronger just because we navigated some of those questions instead of bumping into them when we arrived at
Yeah.
them and like, oh, shoot, now what do we do?
Hmm.
Well, we should have talked about that then. So, what is your immutable
That's the
characteristic?
only immutable characteristic you have. That's
Oh,
it.
I'm sure there are others, but
Okay.
that one, I mean,
Because I
that's
have
the
more than
one.
one.
That's well. Let me think. You give me one or two of yours, and I'll,
Okay.
I'll probably have another one.
Well, when you said working genius, I thought because my top one is discernment.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is an immutable part of me. And that's one of those things that if you ask me to mute it, it almost physically hurts me.
Yeah.
Because that is the flip side of you question other people. If I turn my discernment off, then I'm questioning myself
Yeah.
in a negative way of like, I can't trust myself. And so that for me is one of those things that if I can't trust my discernment because I am a really discerning person, that just feels like I'm denying myself
Yeah.
and going against who I know I am. And so that's one of those things that, and I think too, because loyalty is another thing that for me, I can't turn off. I'm an extremely loyal person to a fault sometimes. Like if somebody has gained my loyalty, it's really
Ooh,
hard
ride or
for them
die.
to lose it. I will make excuses and like,
Yeah.
excuse things, excuse people for things, and accept things from them to a point. But once you lose my loyalty,
Game over.
you're kind of dead to me. Uh, sorry, that's just who it is. But that's one of those things. And so I worked really hard to be loyal to myself. And so that I think that kind of pairs with that discernment.
Yeah,
And
that's
then,
good.
and then empathy. I can't turn my empathy off.
Mm.
We were watching, this is like a sick level of empathy. We were watching American Nightmare. Have you watched that?
No.
Oh, it's a documentary. Crazy story. This woman gets kidnapped in the middle of the night. Nobody believes her boyfriend. Then she gets called like a scam artist because she shows up.
Is it like a documentary?
Yeah, it's a real
Oh,
story. She
yikes.
shows up like days later, fine. Like the kidnappers just drop her back off. And so it's this whole thing. And then as it goes on, I start feeling bad for the kidnapper. Like they start like talking through like his whole thing and he's like a veteran and all these things and he's like real warped in the head and I'm like,
Mm.
I feel bad for him. Like that poor guy, he probably just needs a really good therapist and like and John's looking at me like, what is wrong with you? And I'm like, I don't know. It's the empathy.
Let's
I
see.
just can't turn it off.
Empathizing with Michael. Why did I lose the name? Michael, the horror character.
Oh, Michael Myers.
Michael Myers. Yeah. Yeah. You start empathizing with Michael because he had a bad childhood. I mean,
And
he
I
did.
do that, and my kids get frustrated if somebody's mean to them, and I'm like, well, think about it. And they're like, can you just be mad at them with me? And I'm like, okay, sorry.
So empathy, that's a good example of one of the areas where I need to develop a core competency,
Yeah.
but it's probably not going to be a top strength. Like it's probably because I'm an analytical type of person and I can come across a little cold. It's not intentional, but I need to be willing to like sit in the empathy
Right.
moments with people, even though maybe I'm not going to be like if someone really knows they need someone for that role, they're going to come to you before they come to me, or
Yeah.
tons of other people that I know are great at the empathy thing. Okay, I thought of another one while you
Okay.
were talking about that. I think, and this is a negative thing about me, so maybe a negative immutable characteristic's not a good thing, but I'm sure it could be flipped. There's a positive in there somewhere. I
I
think,
could find it.
yeah, that's right. Perfectionism.
Oh, yeah.
That is one of my like. No matter how hard I try, I still like. I have a hard time saying like this is good enough to go. Like,
Yeah.
I mean, even this is our first full episode of the podcast, and we spent an hour and a half getting the lights set, and I still feel
Yeah.
like,
So if you
they're
don't
not
like
great.
it, don't tell him.
Yeah, don't tell me. Tell me. Leave me a comment. Let me know that how to fix the lights. I know a couple people who I'm gonna be reaching out to after this because it's always in there.
Mhm.
Like that soundtrack is always spinning. Like no matter how hard I say, you know what, like it's not that big of a deal, and
Yeah.
it's not that important, but I want it to be 100% as good as I can get it,
Yeah.
and that's part of me.
Yeah. And I will, so flip side of that, it can be negative. However, working with you through the years, I have seen that you will only hold yourself back with your perfectionism. I've
Hmm.
never once seen you be a detriment
No,
to projects that involved other people.
that's good.
Like if there was a deadline or you knew you were holding other people back, you were willing to
Mm,
let go a little bit. I've only ever seen you be hypercritical of yourself.
yeah.
And most of the time, you are willing to move forward if you know that it's going to hold other people back.
I'll see.
So,
There you go. And I would say, I guess maybe the flip side of it, more of the immutable piece that it at least can be ambiguous enough to be positive or negative is just a tenacity.
yeah.
Like, and that's my other working genius word that Pat Lencioni character or popularized is I'm a wonder and I'm a tenacity. And so I'll latch on to something and I'm going to get it. I mean, 100% if I can get
Yep.
it 100%. But hopefully, like you said, I'm not going to drag people around with me.
Funnily enough, those are my frustrations.
Oh yeah. Well, there you go. That's maybe why we are starting a podcast.
Yeah.
So we can what's the word? Compliment
Yeah.
another in that way.
There
Yeah,
you go. You can drag it across the finish line.
that's right. That's right. This podcast will go out because my tenacity and my
Yep.
perfectionism, even though I may not be happy with the lighting, but it's going to be fine.
It's okay.
So I want to circle back just a little bit for two, just the Brene Brown thing. I want to hear, and maybe we can kind of finish off this first episode with this, but I would love to hear from some of our listeners in the comments, and I would love to hear from you as well, Nikki. What it feels like. Like I know that we've all been around a table where we didn't belong,
Mm-hmm.
and so we're faced with um, this conundrum where we have to either change ourselves or we have to change our environment. And I
Yeah.
feel like we've all kind of been there. And so maybe if you're listening to this and that's you, like maybe the Made for This podcast is here to help you understand that um, you do have a uniqueness and you don't have to be different. You may need a new table, but you don't
Yeah.
need to be different from how you were made to be. So
Right.
I don't know.
That's
What
in my experience when I have sat at tables that I did not belong, where I have fit in, it has always made me question who I am.
mm,
It has always caused me to start to reevaluate myself and ask myself, who am I? Is this a negative thing about me? Those voices that kind of always live in our head, the negative, the
mhm,
self-critical voices get a lot louder. And for me, my self-doubt gets a
mhm,
whole lot louder when I'm around people who don't value me and who don't really see me, or they see me and then say that needs to change. It always makes everything kind of amplify. Um,
mm. That's good.
and I know that those aren't true, helpful, or kind things
Yeah.
for my inner critic to be saying to
Well,
me.
and it always goes back to if we're sitting at the wrong table, it always takes us back to our Fuller Institute questions like,
Right.
okay, what's my purpose? Like maybe my purpose isn't this thing that I thought
Right.
it was. Or maybe I don't belong, or maybe like I'm not who I thought I was.
Yeah.
Like it goes all the way down
Hmm.
to our identity. And I feel like once we start getting thrust back into those questions, now sometimes it's probably healthy for us to evaluate those things. Like maybe we haven't done the work to answer those things appropriately.
Yeah.
But if we have and we feel like, gosh, like I feel like I'm not who I thought I was. Maybe check your environment.
Yeah.
I think that's something to
'Cause I'll
navigate.
say if you've not been in places where you do belong, it's hard to recognize
Mm,
when you don't. If you are someone who, I was talking with my husband about this the other day, much of my teenage years were spent kind of masking
mm,
and fitting in. And I was this chameleon that I could assess a group and know exactly what I needed to do to be able to get into that group. And for that reason, I just kind of moved from groups of people consistently and never really had a true like group of friends or even a true best friend for any period of time, because when the real me started to shine, kind of the jig was up and I didn't actually belong there.
Right.
And then the relationships would just kind of end. But I think if you don't know the flip side of it, if you've never actually showed up as wholly you and belonged somewhere, it's really hard. You almost feel like you're just wrong.
Yeah, that's good. Have you seen the new Mean Girls?
I haven't yet. No.
Okay, I haven't either. But I do remember the one that came out when we were teenagers or whatever it was. And I just see in my head as you were talking about
Yeah.
that, like she walked into the kitchen or the cafeteria,
Mhm.
and it was like this table of the jocks and this table of
Yep.
the preppy people, and like we've all been there.
Yeah.
Like if you went to public school, you've definitely experienced this,
In
and
really adult years,
yeah,
it
and
just looks different.
yeah, that's what I was gonna say. It just continues. It
Mhm.
looks different, and it maybe is a little bit less overt.
Mhm.
Maybe not. I don't know. It depends on where you are.
Yeah.
And yeah, so yeah, that's something I would love to hear from anyone who's listening. Send us an email or drop us a comment. Let us know if you've ever experienced that. I'm willing to bet that you have.
Yeah.
And what did you do about it? We would love to hear that. Is there anything like else you want to touch on before we kind of wrap up the topic of what is made for this?
No, I think we covered it all.
I think we might have covered it all. We talked Brene Brown. We talked Fuller Institute. We talked radical belonging and your unique seat at the table. We talked about all the key pieces.
And now everybody's going to use it as a noun.
Everyone should use it as a noun. Like, listen, if you are watching or listening to this, start using it as a noun. And a hashtag. I think hashtags are going away.
Yeah.
I think hashtags are going. But anyway, you can still use it as a hashtag. Just put it on things. Draw it on your notebook or get a tattoo. That's hashtag made for this.
It's a little permanent. Get a QR code right next to it. They can die together.
That's right. That's right. The QR code. And people can scan until you get a little older and it starts to change.
So that's all for this episode. But next week, we are going to be talking about why you're made for this matters. Why is it a big deal and why do you want to discover it?
Yeah, so don't forget to like, subscribe, follow us on whatever platform you are consuming this, YouTube, if you're watching, or wherever you're finding this. Don't forget to follow along so you don't miss the next episode.